Hello, my name is Katharine Hayhoe, and I am so delighted to be with you here for the very first climate fair on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia. So I am a climate scientist. I study how the choices that we're making are affecting not only our future, but the places where we live, the food we eat, the homes we live in, the water we drink, the air that we breathe. And I speak with people all around the world. I'm originally from Toronto myself, live in Texas now, talk to people all the time, all around the world, about why climate change matters and about what we can do about it. And so often I ask people, and I'm sorry I can't ask you right now because this actually is not live, it's recorded, but if it were live, I would be asking you this question, which I often ask people, which is, when I say climate change, how do you feel? Now go ahead and think of a word. When I say climate change, how do you feel? And now I'm going to show you a typical response that I get when I ask people that question. Anxious, scared, worried, sad, depressed, concerned, hopeless, angry, frustrated. And when I see these words, I think the most important thing we need to know is, if this is the way you feel, that means you're normal. That means that you actually understand what's happening. You understand the magnitude of the problem, how it's affecting every aspect of our lives. In fact, if you aren't worried about climate change, that isn't normal. So if you feel this way, you are not alone. And in fact, that is exactly the way I and all of my colleagues who study this feel when we look at how the choices that we're making as humans are affecting our planet. Now, often people refer to climate change as global warming, which refers to the increase in the average temperature of our planet. But how you and I are experiencing the impacts of climate change in our lives today is more akin to what I think of as global weirding. What do I mean by that? Well, wherever we live, it's as if we have this pair of weather dice, and we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. That's a heat wave, a drought, a flood, a wildfire, a storm, or something else, right? But as the world gets warmer decade by decade, it's taking one number on those dice and then another one and replacing them with sixes. And then it's even replacing some of those numbers with a 7 and an 8. So wherever we live around the world, we're witnessing what I think of as global weirding. We're seeing that our heat wave season is starting earlier in the year and it's lasting longer. Heat waves are a lot hotter and more dangerous than they used to be. We're seeing that wildfire is burning greater area, and you certainly know all about that. We see that droughts are longer and stronger. We see that hurricanes and tornadoes and typhoons are bigger and they're dumping a lot more rain on people. We're seeing that, atmospheric rivers, what those are, those rivers of moisture that come across the Pacific. And then when they hit the mountains, they start to rise. They dump huge amounts of rain on the coast. They're getting stronger and more intense and dumping more rain because warmer air holds more water vapor. So of course, we're also seeing the increase in heavy rainfall and flood events too. Wherever we live around the world, we're seeing this evidence of global weirding. And right here in Canada, and in fact in Western Canada, in BC, what we're seeing is summers are obviously getting hotter. They're getting windier too, according to Environment Canada. Rainfall is becoming much more erratic, feast or famine. Not enough until you have too much. Snowpack and snowfall goes up and down from year to year, but overall, decade by decade, it's going down, which means drier conditions to start the year in the summer. We also see, of course, that fire season is starting earlier in the year, and lightning strikes are more frequent because for us, most of our fire ignitions come from lightning strikes. A few come from accidental human ignition as well. And of course, along the coastline, sea level is rising and the oceans are warming too. So we're seeing these impacts really from coast to coast. We know that the deadly floods that British Columbia experienced a few years ago were at least twice as likely thanks to climate change loading the weather dice against us. We know that the deadly heat wave and the wildfires that happened back in 2021 were at least 150 times more likely because of human-caused climate change. And we also know that over a third of the area burned by wildfire across all of North America since the 1980s was the result of the direct carbon emissions from 88 companies. So we see how climate change is loading the weather dice all around us, and today it's already affecting our lives. The United States actually has more billion-dollar weather and climate disasters than any other country. Back in the 1980s in the US, there was about $1 billion weather and climate disaster on average every 4 months, so about 3 a year. Accounting for how the value of the dollar has changed over time, of course. Now, there's one every 3 weeks. And in fact, last year, there's one every 2 weeks. We are seeing the same in Canada. As you can see here, and this is just a new headline from an article just actually yesterday, we see that Canada's insurance sector is facing catastrophic deluge of climate-related claims. The insurance industry crunches the numbers. They know that climate change is no longer a future issue. It's affecting us now. It is not an issue just about over there. It is affecting us here. And so still too often, in my opinion, we talk about this issue as if we're saving the planet. We say, well, what can we do to save the planet? But the problem is that sets up this conflict between, well, people or the planet, the environment or the economy. You might remember that from the days of Stephen Harper. There was actually that rhetoric going around. But what I would say is it is not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we are gone. It truly is about saving us. And when I say us, I want to make sure I'm including both human and non-human life there. Nature doesn't need us. We're the one who needs nature. Our life depends on nature. The air that we breathe, that increasingly is becoming contaminated with wildfire smoke as well as pollution. The buildings and the roads and the systems we use that were all built for conditions and for a planet that no longer exists. That's how quickly things are changing within our own lifetimes. And of course, the amazing nature that surrounds us. Climate is changing, and it is putting all of these things at risk. So if this makes you feel worried and anxious, it should. That's how I feel when I look at that. So that leads to a natural question, and this is one of the most frequent questions I'm asked, and it's the most frequent question that many of my colleagues are asked. It is, are we screwed? And I will give you a straight answer to that question based on the science. My answer is, it depends. On what? On us. That's right. The number one uncertainty in what's going to happen in the future, because the future is not written in stone, the number one uncertainty is not cloud feedbacks or ocean currents. It's us. It's the choices we make. Look at it this way. The bad news is we're responsible. We've checked, and humans, specifically digging up and burning coal, gas, and oil, that's about 78% of the problem. And then deforestation, land use change, and large-scale industrial agriculture, that's 22% of the problem. So through our human actions and our choices, we are responsible for more than 100% of the observed warming. How can we be responsible for more than 100%, you may ask? It's because according to natural factors right now, the Earth should be very slowly, gradually cooling, just a little bit, according to changes in the sun and natural cycles. Instead, we're warming faster and faster. And so the bad news is we're responsible. But what's the good news? The good news is that means that we can fix it. If it was a natural cycle or the sun, we couldn't really fix that. But we're responsible, which means we can fix it. The bad news is we can't do it alone. But the good news is we can do it together. And the even better news is we are not alone. There is action that is already happening in cities and towns and groups and organizations and schools and universities and hospitals and churches and businesses all across Canada. It's happening all across North America. It's happening all across the world. Climate action is already happening. So that begs another question, which I think is even more important, which is, where do we start? How do we get this thing going? How do we get this giant boulder of climate action rolling down that hill fast enough to actually make a difference? That's the question I think we all want the answer to. So I'm going to try to give you some of my answer to that, but you've got this amazing panel coming up next that can also talk about this. And really, answering this question is an ongoing dialogue. And the answer is going to be a little bit different depending on who we are and where we are and what's happening where we are. So what I want to do, though, is I just want to give you a frame to start to answer that question. And my frame to start to answer the question of how can we speed this thing up does not begin with the science, and it doesn't begin with the solutions. It has nothing to do with solar panels or clean energy. It has nothing to do with climate adaptation, even though that's my own field. It starts with our attitudes and perspectives, because we're the ones who have the ability to make those choices. So often we think that me and everybody I know and everybody who's here, obviously, we are all worried about climate change. But there's this huge group of people over there that are not worried because they never want to talk about it. And so if that's the case, what do we need to do? We need to make them worried, right? Well, here's the thing. It turns out that according to the neuroscience, fear and anxiety cause us in general, especially if we don't know what to do with that fear and anxiety, to withdraw, to freeze, and to give up rather than take action. That is a direct quote from a neuroscientist named Talia Sharot, who wrote a really good book called The Influential Brain, talking simply about how our brain works. Not climate change, just the human brain. So going back to how we think people think, we think I'm worried and everybody I know is worried, but most people aren't. No. It turns out that when we look at the data is very clear that most people are already worried. I'm pretty sure some of the people who claim they aren't worried actually are. They're just pushing it down harder. But the majority of people are already worried. But only a tiny fraction are activated. Let's look at the United States, where 2/3 of people in the United States, when you ask them, are you worried about climate change, would say yes. 2/3 of people in the United States would say yes. When you ask people, have you been affected by the extreme weather we're seeing, the extreme heat, the drought, the floods, the wildfire, 9 out of 10 Americans would say yes. What about here in Canada? How many of us are worried? A survey last year showed that 70% of Canadians would say they're either very worried or worried. Very or worried. And if you zoom in here, you can zoom in to looking at the total number of worried in British Columbia. 74% in British Columbia are worried. Now you might say, well, that's just Canada. What about the world? Here's the world. Anywhere, any country that is gray wasn't surveyed. Any country that is pink means more than 60% of people in that country are worried. And you can see the only countries that are less than pink are countries where basically people even don't know if they'll even wake up in their beds tomorrow safe, if they'll have food to feed their children, if they'll have clean water to drink, or if they'll die of some sickness that none of us should be dying from the year 2024. Most countries in the world, people are already worried, but they don't know what to do. And the neuroscience actually explains this. It says not only that fear paralyzes us, but that our human brain is built to move forwards to a reward, not to avoid harm. So again, neuroscientist continues and says, reframe whatever you're talking about, and this applies directly to climate change, so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. We do not only need an apocalypse to run from, and believe me, we've had apocalypses to run from already. 2021, the heat waves, the wildfires, the town of Lytton, BC, breaking the all-time high temperature record here for Canada for 1, 2, 3 days in a row, and then almost the entire town burning down on the 4th day. And then the wildfire smoke choking the air last summer, again and again and again, not just in BC, but all the way to the East Coast and back again. We have the apocalypses already. We're seeing them. We need to understand there's a problem. But we also need to know, what are we running towards? What does a better future look like for the people and the places and the things we love? And so to get this thing moving faster, we have to make 2 key connections. What are they? The first thing we have to connect is we have to connect our head to our heart. What do I mean by that? Well, all of the data and facts and information and worry we have is all up in our head. But for many of us, we still haven't made the connection to the heart. How is climate change affecting the places I love, the things I love, the people I love? And that's an easy connection to make, isn't it? Many people live where you live because they love the nature that surrounds them. They love the trees, the forests, the ocean, the skies, the mountains, the snow. I'm from, like I said, the other part of the country, but I love where I'm from too. I love the Canadian Shield. I love our lakes. I love our trees. That's where I grew up. I grew up running through the woods every summer, and I am passionate about the place I'm from. But it's not just about the places that we love. It's also about the things we enjoy doing. I enjoy skiing. You need snow for that. I enjoy chocolate, and gosh, the chocolate harvest actually these past couple of years have been horrible because of rainfall patterns and destruction of the chocolate crops. Who do you love? I'm a mom, and I would do anything to fight for a better world for my child. Now, this head-to-heart connection is really important because all too often, and listen to me carefully here because I hear a lot of people doing this and just not getting it. This is very important. Making that head-to-heart connection doesn't mean you have to make everybody care for the same reason you do. Good luck doing that with anyone. You can't. Imagine how foolish it is if you say, well, I care because I'm a parent. I do too because I'm a parent. Imagine if then everybody had to have a child to care about climate change. That's ridiculous, right? I'm a scientist and I care because I'm a scientist. Does everybody have to study science to care about climate change? I ski. Do we have to teach everybody to ski to get them to care about climate change? No. We don't have to make people care for the same reason we do. We have to figure out what they already care about, and that involves a lot more listening than it does talking, right? And then help them make their own connection between their head and their heart, because I'm convinced, and I've had thousands of conversations to convince me of this, that to care about climate change, you don't have to be a certain type of person. You don't have to be somebody who loves nature. You don't have to be somebody who cares about, something that's very obviously associated with the environment or climate change. You don't have to be an environmentalist. You don't have to be an activist. You just have to be a human being living on planet Earth, and we're all that. We all have every reason we need to care. And in fact, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Not Saving the Planet, but Saving Us. And in that book, I tell so many stories about how I've started conversations over a shared love of wine, or a shared love of outdoor sports, or a shared concern about the place where we live, a shared interest, a shared faith, even a shared passion for knitting. And believe me, if you can start a conversation about climate change over knitting, you can start a conversation about anything. In fact, I even have a story in my book about someone from BC who, after he retired, he just decided to go out to the parks and start conversations with people by asking them on a scale from 1 to 10 how worried they were about climate change, and then why. And he listened to what they had to say, and pretty soon even people from the oil patches in Alberta were telling him why they cared about climate change. There's a few people that won't work on, but by a few, I mean just a handful out of 1,000. Most people really do care, and if you give them a chance to make that connection, that's what powers our action, our hearts. The data I showed you of how many people around the world are worried, the researchers went on and they asked people around the world, why? Why do you want to take climate action? And they expected to get different answers in different parts of the world. But much to their surprise, even though, some people supported green jobs, some people supported doing the right thing, the moral argument, some people supported taking away subsidies from fossil fuels, people supported all different types of arguments, but around the world there was one motivation that stood out as the number one reason why anyone would want to act on climate change. And you know what that one reason was? Love. So making that head-to-heart connection, especially love for the people in our lives, especially love for the next generation who will inherit this earth from us, making that head-to-heart connection is so important to motivating climate action. In fact, it's so important that I'm increasingly convinced that spending time with the people you love in the places you love, doing the things you love, is climate action, because that's how we're charging our batteries. But that's not enough. We have to make one more connection. Remember, I said there's two connections. The first connection is from your head to your heart, and the second connection is from your heart to your hands. because we can all be worried, we can all be passionate, we can all care, but if we don't know what to do, we won't do anything. So what does making that connection to our hands look like? It looks like engaging on solutions. Now, I know that the panel coming up is going to get into that in detail. So again, I'm just going to give you a frame that we can talk about solutions with. And the frame that I like using is the frame of a swimming pool. Specifically, an above ground swimming pool like I grew up with in my backyard in Toronto where I learned to swim. So when I learned to swim, my toes could just touch the ground. If you think of the swimming pool as the atmosphere, and the level of water in the pool like the heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, back before the Industrial Revolution, our toes just touched the ground. But at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we stuck a giant hose in the swimming pool, and we've been turning the hose up every year. So the level of water in our swimming pool is not only going up and up and up, it's going up faster and faster because every year there's more water coming out of the hose. So what do we have to do? We have to do 3 things. Number 1, turn off the hose, right? Number 2, make the drain bigger so it takes more water out of the pool. And number 3, our toes don't touch the ground in many places. We have to learn how to swim. What do those look like? Well, as I often say, when it comes to climate solutions, there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that if everybody did that one thing, that would fix it. There isn't. Heat-trapping gas emissions are woven throughout every aspect of our energy systems, our building stock, our food systems, our transportation systems, our natural resource systems. It's part of every aspect of our lives. That's the bad news. But again, the good news means that there's so many solutions that work. Turning off the hose. How? Through efficiency. We waste so much of our energy, over 60% of it. Then, of course, clean energy, replacing what we can't reduce through efficiency with clean energy rather than dirty, polluting fossil fuels. Better land use and agriculture to take carbon up rather than put it back into the atmosphere. Behavioral change. We don't need to be using all the energy we do. And then for the very few last drops in that hose, the very few expensive last drops that we can't get rid of any other way, high dollar technologies that are very energy intensive like carbon capture and storage once we've done everything else that we can. There's this great resource called Project Drawdown, and if you go there, you'll see they have so many good solutions describing, for example, what efficiency would look like, what clean energy would look like, what responsible agriculture would look like. But remember, our pool has a drain, and most of that drain is nature. We have too much carbon in the atmosphere where we don't want it. We don't have enough carbon back in the soil and the ecosystems and the forests where we do want it. So investing in nature, we can take so much of that carbon out of the atmosphere through protecting the ecosystems we already have. Old growth forests take up and contain and store a lot more carbon than new growth ones do. So protect the ecosystems we already have, number 1. Number 2, restore the ecosystems that have become degraded. Number 3, then regenerate the ones that we cut down already. But number 4, climate smart agriculture. At Nature United, we did an analysis for the whole country of Canada that showed that the greatest potential to make the drain bigger in Canada at the lowest cost is through climate smart agriculture. And then for the last few drops in the drain, the expensive energy intensive technology like, for example, direct air capture. It has a place, a small one, after we've done everything else on the list. But there's one more thing we have to do, and that is we have to learn how to swim. We have to adapt. Our infrastructure wasn't built for this world today anymore. Our insurance rates are soaring. Our social networks, our technological adaptations, our ecosystem adaptations. Did you know that low-income neighborhoods in some of our biggest cities can be 6 or 7 degrees Celsius hotter during a heat wave than a high-income neighborhood in the same city? And the number one reason is lack of green space. Planting trees and putting green space in our urban areas. We just actually did a new study down in the States where we showed in Louisville, Kentucky, that planting trees and vegetation and green space in low-income neighborhoods reduces inflammation. It improves heart health. It reduces air pollution. It helps people cool off. It improves people's mental health as well as their physical health. There's these amazing win-win-wins to climate solutions. Oh, I didn't even mention biodiversity, did I? So there's no silver bullet, but there's so much silver buckshot. And for every conversation, for every context, we can bring up these amazing solutions. And how does this all begin? It begins with something so simple we often don't even think about it. We jump right over it. Remember I showed you this map showing how people are worried around the world, and then researchers asked one more question. They said, do you ever talk about it? And the answer here is no. People are not talking about it. And this is crazy because how do humans ever do anything together if we don't talk about it? Talking changes how we see ourselves. It changes what people around us think. It changes our social norms, what we see as acceptable or not. It changes our sense of efficacy. In other words, if I do something, will it make a difference? That's what efficacy is. And it changes our ability and willingness to act. If you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever do anything about it? The goal of these conversations is not to tell people about climate change. It's to bring them into the conversation to what? To help them make the head to the heart to the hands connection. So if you go to my Threads account, if you go to my Instagram account, if you find me online, you will see a post pinned to the top of my account. And that post answers the question, if I'm worried about climate change, what can I do? Number one, have a conversation that helps connect the head to the heart to the hands. Number two, join a climate group that amplifies your voice. We can't do this alone, but we absolutely can do this together. Use your voice to spark change where you work or where you study. Use your voice to tell our elected officials at every level that this matters. Did you know that elected officials systematically underestimate people's levels of concern about climate change? Why? Because they don't hear from them. And we are fortunate that we live in a country where all the way from the federal level to the city level, we have much better access to our candidates and elected officials than they do in countries like the US. Use that access with your voice. Speak with your money. The banks that you use, you got Van City right there. You got banks that have divested from fossil fuels. Where do you put your credit card? Where do you put your pension? And then make changes in your personal life, in your family's life, with your neighbors, with your people you walk your dog with, your organization, but then make those changes contagious by talking about them. As Bill McKibben says, who's a great thinker in this area, he says the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. So in order to help with these conversations, I have a weekly newsletter I started because people are like, well, what am I supposed to say to connect the head and the heart and the hands? So my weekly newsletter every single week shares good news in green about solutions that are already happening. In red, it shares not so good news about how climate change is affecting us in ways that we can relate to and identify with. And then in blue, every single week, I share something that we can do that we can share with others as well. So if you're interested, the QR code is right there. You can sign up on LinkedIn as well. I've got a Talking Climate account on Instagram and Threads too. And what I want to do with that is give you the tools that you need to have these conversations. Because the giant boulder of climate action that I mentioned before, it's not sitting at the bottom of the cliff. It's already at the top of the hill and it is rolling down the hill in the right direction and it has millions of hands on it. And if I add mine and you add yours, and if we use our voice to encourage others to add theirs, that is where change begins. So we know the science is clear that a better future is possible. The science is clear that every bit of warming matters, every action matters, every choice matters. That is a direct quote from the IPCC. But we know that we can't get there alone. We can only get there together. And how do we work together as humans? Our work together begins with the conversation today.